It started with a feeling. I always thought gut instincts were just dramatizations from TV shows, but as it turned out, they were much more real than I ever wanted them to be. Something about the way Melissa's phone screen would dim when I walked into the room, or how her smile seemed brighter around certain company made me uneasy. I told myself I was being paranoid, work stress, too many late nights, or my own insecurities bubbling up. But doubts have a way of planting themselves like weeds, and soon enough, they were growing wild in my mind. Victor Sterling. My boss. A man who walked into any room like he owned the place, a smug grin plastered across his chiseled face. He was everything I wasn't: charismatic, wealthy, and oozing confidence. People like Victor were used to getting what they wanted without asking twice. I never thought for a second that he'd set his sights on my wife. But life, it seems, has a cruel sense of irony. The day I found out, it felt like my life had taken a nosedive. I was supposed to be out of town for work, attending one of Victor's networking events. Ironically, the hotel had messed up my reservation, forcing me to drive back home late that evening. I should have called ahead, but exhaustion got the better of me. My headlights washed over a car in the driveway I didn't recognize at first. Sleek, red, and undeniably Victor's prized possession. My stomach dropped. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards under my boots echoing in the silence. At first, I thought maybe they weren't home. Then, muffled laughter drifted down from upstairs. My heart pounded harder than it did during combat missions in the Marines. Each step up the staircase felt heavier than the last. What I saw when I opened the door wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. There they were, entangled in each other in my bed, the place where my wife and I shared dreams, fears, and everything in between. Melissa looked startled at first, but Victor? He just smirked, pulling the blanket lazily over himself as if this were a casual morning after. I couldn't even process words. The rage came first, searing and primal, but then it gave way to a deep, bone-crushing sadness. "Get out," was all I managed to choke out, my voice low but trembling. Victor stood, unbothered, pulling on his shirt. "Guess the cat's out of the bag," he quipped, his tone laced with mockery. Melissa tried to speak, something about how it wasn't what it looked like, a cliché straight out of a bad soap opera. I didn't stay to hear the rest. I turned on my heel, walked out, and slammed the door behind me. I spent the night in a dingy motel just outside town. The walls smelled like mildew, and the bed was lumpy, but I didn't care. I sat there staring at the blank TV screen, trying to process how my life had crumbled in a single evening. All I knew was that I couldn't let them get away with it. Not this time. Melissa wasn't just my wife. She was my anchor, the person I trusted to have my back after everything I'd seen and done in the service. And Victor. He wasn't just some random fling. He was my boss, a man I had to face every day at work. They didn't just cross a line, they obliterated it. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the seeds of an idea had sprouted in the chaos of my thoughts. Revenge wasn't just a fantasy, it was a necessity. The morning after was brutal. The kind of morning where the light from the window feels like it's mocking you, highlighting the wreckage of the life you once knew. My phone buzzed incessantly, calls and texts from Melissa. I didn't answer a single one. What could she say to make this better? "Sorry, Gavin, I didn't mean to betray you with your boss." Yeah, that would go over great. I drove back to the house. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. My things were there, and I wasn't going to let them turn me into some shadow that slinks away quietly. The house was eerily quiet when I walked in, though it felt different now, like the walls themselves were judging me for being too blind to see what had been happening. Melissa was in the kitchen. She must have heard me come in because she immediately started talking, her words tumbling over each other like she was trying to outrun the truth. "Gavin, I'm so sorry." "Stop." I raised a hand, cutting her off. My voice was colder than I expected it to be, but that wasn't a bad thing. "I don't want to hear it. Please, let me explain," she begged, stepping closer. I could see the streaks of mascara on her face, the redness in her eyes. She looked like a mess, but it didn't stir any sympathy in me. If anything, it just made me angrier. "There's nothing to explain, Melissa. You slept with him. You broke this." I gestured between us, my hand shaking slightly despite my effort to stay composed. She hesitated, then tried to twist the narrative, as if her betrayal was somehow my fault. You've been so distant lately, Gavin. You throw yourself into work and barely have time for me. I was lonely. That hit a nerve. Lonely? I echoed, my voice rising despite myself. You were lonely, so you decided to shack up with Victor? Do you even hear how pathetic that sounds? She started to cry again, but I wasn't falling for it. Not this time. I had spent years bending over backward for this marriage, and now she wanted to act like she was the victim? No chance. I'm going upstairs to pack a bag, I said flatly. You can figure out your own excuses for why this happened, but don't pin it on me. As I turned to head upstairs, her voice stopped me. You're really just going to walk away? After everything we've been through? I didn't even turn around. You already walked away, Melissa. I'm just catching up. Packing was harder than I thought it'd be. Every item I grabbed felt like it had a story attached. The shirt I wore on our anniversary dinner. The watch she bought me for my birthday last year. Even my old boots by the door reminded me of weekend hikes we used to take. It was like the house itself was taunting me with memories I couldn't escape. By the time I was done, I had 2 duffel bags filled with clothes and essentials. I left my wedding ring on the nightstand. No dramatic flourish, just a simple act of leaving it behind where it belonged. As I lugged the bags to my truck, Melissa followed me out, still pleading. We can fix this, Gavin. I'll go to therapy, whatever it takes. Please. I paused at the truck door, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. Therapy doesn't fix betrayal, Melissa. It doesn't erase what you did. With that, I climbed in and drove off. I didn't look back. The man I was before that night, the husband, the trusting fool, was gone. All that was left was a storm brewing in his place, and it wasn't going to settle until justice was served. I spent the night at another cheap motel, trying to come up with a plan. Something that would let them know just how deeply they'd cut me without stooping to their level. Victor Sterling had taken enough from me. It was time to take something back. The day after I left the house, I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, staring at the gray horizon. I had no destination in mind, just a head full of rage and nowhere to put it. Victor Sterling had always been smug, but now? He was a man who thought he'd won. He thought he could walk into my life, take what was mine, and leave me to pick up the pieces. That image burned into me like fire licking at dry wood. I drove aimlessly, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. The more I thought about it, the clearer my purpose became. I wasn't just going to let him get away with this. Victor needed to learn what it felt like to lose something valuable, to have everything crumble in front of him. I stopped at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with sticky menus and waitresses who called everyone Han. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and stared at my phone, scrolling through my contacts. The Marine in me had always been a planner. Chaos was an enemy best beaten with strategy, and I needed to be precise. Revenge wasn't about lashing out, it was about striking at the heart of someone's arrogance and ripping it apart piece by piece. I knew where to start. Victor Sterling wasn't untouchable. He was rich, sure, but he had secrets, and secrets had a way of ruining men like him. I'd seen enough in the service to know that no one's armor was impenetrable. A quick search online brought up an address for an old Marine buddy of mine, Jake. He was the kind of guy who could find a needle in a haystack and tell you the exact day it was dropped there. We hadn't talked in years, but Jake owed me one. He lived a couple of towns over, so I paid for my coffee, hopped in the truck, and started driving. Jake's place was exactly as I remembered. Modest but well kept, with an old Jeep out front and a dog that barked like a drill sergeant the moment I stepped onto the porch. Jake answered the door in a flannel shirt and jeans, his face lighting up in surprise when he saw me. "Gavin Brooks," he said, pulling me into a firm handshake that turned into a quick bro hug. "Man, it's been a while. What brings you to my neck of the woods?" "Trouble," I said bluntly, stepping inside. Jake gave me a knowing look. "Sit down. Beer or coffee?" "Coffee," I said. "Got a lot to figure out." I told him everything. Melissa, Victor, the betrayal. Jake listened without interrupting, his expression hardening as I spoke. By the time I finished, he looked like he was ready to fight someone himself. "That's some cold-blooded stuff, Gavin," he said, shaking his head. "But I know you didn't come here just to vent." What's the plan? I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. I need dirt on Victor. The kind that makes him sweat. You still have that setup for digging into people's lives. Jake grinned, tapping the side of his head. Once a spook, always a spook. What kind of dirt are we talking? Anything that'll hit him where it hurts. Money, reputation, his little empire. He thinks he's untouchable, but I want to prove him wrong. Jake nodded, already reaching for his laptop. Give me a couple of hours. I'll see what I can find. While Jake worked, I took a walk to clear my head. The crisp air stung my face, but it helped me think. I didn't feel like the same guy who left that house. The man who once believed in loyalty and trust was gone. In his place was someone sharper, harder, and ready to fight back. When I got back to Jake's, he was leaning over his laptop, a satisfied smirk on his face. Found something, he said, turning the screen toward me. What I saw was enough to make my pulse quicken. Victor had skeletons, all right, financial irregularities, questionable offshore accounts, and some heavy debts tied to shady characters. The kind of stuff that could make his pristine reputation crumble if it ever saw the light of day. This is gold, I said, leaning closer. Jake leaned back, crossing his arms. Careful, Gavin. This kind of information is a double-edged sword. You sure you want to go down this road? I nodded without hesitation. He took everything from me, Jake. It's time he learned what it feels like to lose. Jake handed me a flash drive. It's all here. Use it wisely. As I left his place that night, the weight in my chest felt lighter. I didn't know exactly how I'd use the information yet, but one thing was certain. Victor Sterling's days of smug superiority were numbered. With the flash drive in my pocket, I felt like I was holding a grenade, the pin already pulled. The information Jake found was everything I needed to disrupt Victor's carefully curated life. Now, I just had to figure out how to deliver the blow. I spent the next day laying low at a motel on the edge of town. The place smelled like stale cigarettes, and the bed creaked if you so much as breathed, but it gave me time to think. The flash drive was a weapon, but I needed a plan to wield it. Victor was a man who thrived on his reputation. Polished, respected, untouchable. If I could tarnish that, he'd crumble. I started small, dipping into the network of people I knew at work. Victor might have been the boss, but even in a company, there are always people who watch from the sidelines, taking notes on the flaws and cracks no one else sees. I made a few calls, casual at first, testing the waters. Hey, Rachel, it's Gavin. How's everything in the finance department? Oh, same as usual. You know how Victor likes to micromanage, Rachel replied, her voice tinged with mild annoyance. That was my opening. Yeah, I've noticed. Ever wonder if there's more going on with him than meets the eye? Guy's always working some angle. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then let out a soft laugh. You're not wrong. I mean, have you ever seen the way he handles those special accounts? It's like he's guarding a pot of gold. Bingo. I pressed just enough to plant a seed of doubt in her mind without overplaying my hand. The goal wasn't to expose Victor outright. Not yet. It was to get people talking, to build a current that would sweep him off his feet when the time was right. Meanwhile, Melissa kept trying to contact me. Texts, calls, even an email with a subject line that read, "We need to talk." I ignored every attempt. She didn't deserve an audience, not after what she'd done. But even in silence, she found ways to haunt me. I kept replaying that moment in my mind, the way she looked at me when I caught them. No guilt, just panic that her little secret was out. Part of me wanted to confront her, to lay everything out and make her understand just how badly she'd broken me. But another part of me knew it wouldn't matter. She'd made her choices, and I had no interest in cleaning up her mess. By midweek, I had a clearer picture of my plan. Victor's downfall wouldn't come from me alone, it would come from the cracks in his own foundation. I just had to shine a light on them. I compiled the files from the flash drive, screenshots of his offshore accounts, records of mysterious wire transfers, and emails that hinted at under-the-table deals. Then I created an anonymous email address and drafted a message to a few key players at work. Rachel in finance, a couple of ambitious juniors who'd been vocal about their frustrations, and one of Victor's rivals in the corporate hierarchy. The email was simple but effective. Thought you might find this interesting. Some things aren't as they seem in Victor Sterling's world. Just follow the paper trail. Attached were a handful of documents, enough to stir curiosity but not so much that it would trace back to me. I wanted them to dig deeper, to connect the dots themselves. People are more invested in a scandal when they think they've uncovered it on their own. The next day, I walked into the office as if nothing was wrong. The tension in the air was palpable. Whispers floated around the cubicles, and Victor's door was shut, a rarity for a man who loved to flaunt his open-door policy. I played dumb, casually asking Rachel if everything was all right. "You haven't heard," she said, lowering her voice. "There's some stuff going around about Victor. Finance is in a frenzy trying to make sense of it all." I feigned surprise. "Wow. Any idea what it's about?" She glanced around, then leaned closer. "Something about offshore accounts. If it's true, it could be bad, like really bad." Inside, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Outside, I kept my expression neutral. "Crazy," I said, shaking my head. "Guess we'll see what happens." I knew Victor well enough to predict his next move. He'd try to control the narrative, spinning the accusations as baseless rumors. But the thing about lies is that they unravel quickly when too many people start pulling at the threads. For the first time since this whole mess began, I felt like I was in control again. The trap was set, and it was only a matter of time before Victor Sterling walked right into it. It didn't take long for the cracks to spread. By the end of the week, the office was buzzing with rumors. Victor tried to maintain his usual air of confidence, but I could see the strain creeping into his posture, the way he closed his door more often and barked orders at his assistant. For a man who thrived on being untouchable, the sudden spotlight was clearly taking its toll. I kept my head down, sticking to my work, playing the part of the oblivious employee. It was hard not to smirk when I overheard snippets of whispered conversations. "Did you see that memo from HR? Something about investigating financial irregularities. I heard the board's getting involved. This could be big. Victor's not looking so smug anymore, is he?" Each comment was a small victory, a reminder that my plan was working. That Friday, I got a call from Melissa. I didn't answer, as usual, but this time she left a voicemail. Her voice was shaky, panicked. "Gavin, please, I need to talk to you. Victor's in trouble, and I think you know something about it. Just, please call me back." I listened to the message twice, letting her desperation sink in. It felt good. For once, she was the one grasping for answers, while I held all the cards. But there was no chance I'd give her the satisfaction of a response. Instead, I drove to a nearby park and took a long walk, letting the cool air clear my mind. Revenge wasn't just about taking them down, it was about reclaiming my sense of power, my dignity. And I wasn't done yet. The following Monday, things escalated. Victor's name was the only topic of conversation in the office. By lunch, an official email had gone out from the CEO, announcing a third-party audit into recent allegations of misconduct. It was phrased diplomatically, but the message was clear. Victor Sterling was under fire. I made my way to the break room, grabbing a cup of coffee and pretending not to notice the hushed voices around me. Rachel caught my eye and waved me over. "Gavin, have you heard? This is insane." "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone casual. "What's the latest?" She leaned in, her voice low. "Apparently, Victor's been funneling company funds into personal accounts. Offshore, no less. The auditors are tearing through his records as we speak." I raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold move. If it's true, he's done." She nodded, her excitement barely contained. "They're saying he could lose everything. His job, his assets, maybe even face charges. I mean, who does something that reckless?" I shrugged, sipping my coffee. "Guess power makes people think they're untouchable." Rachel shook her head in disbelief. "Well, he's about to learn otherwise." Victor didn't show his face much that day. When he finally emerged from his office, he looked like a man on the edge. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a frantic energy as he barked into his phone, pacing the hallway. The sight was almost satisfying. Almost. But I wasn't done yet. That evening, I sent out another email, this time to a local journalist who covered business scandals. The subject line was simple. Tip about Victor Sterling. I attached a few more incriminating files and included a brief note. You might want to look into this. The public deserves to know the truth. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Headlines painted Victor as the face of corporate greed, complete with details about his shady dealings and misuse of company funds. The article even hinted at a possible connection to organized crime, thanks to some of the names tied to his offshore accounts. It was the kind of scandal that destroyed not just careers, but lives. Melissa called again that night. This time, she didn't leave a voicemail, but she texted instead. Gavin, I know you're behind this. Please, let's talk. You're going too far. Too far? The audacity of her words made me laugh out loud. She had no idea what too far looked like. I didn't reply, of course. Melissa had made her bed, quite literally, with Victor. Now they could lie in it together, choking on the mess they'd made. Victor Sterling's empire was crumbling, and Melissa was watching it happen from the front row. The trap had been sprung, and it was more glorious than I'd imagined. But there was one more move left to make, and I wasn't going to stop until the final piece was in place. By Wednesday, Victor's name was plastered all over the news. The company issued a statement distancing itself from him, the board placed him on administrative leave, and rumors swirled about law enforcement getting involved. At the office, the man who once walked in like he owned the place was now reduced to hurried, shamed departures with his head down. I watched it all unfold quietly. If anyone noticed my satisfaction, they didn't say a word. I made sure to stay out of the spotlight, just another employee witnessing the mighty Victor Sterling's downfall. But Melissa wasn't as quiet. She cornered me outside the gym one evening, her face pale, her eyes wide with desperation. I almost didn't recognize her. The confident woman I once loved now looked frayed, like a thread pulled too tight and ready to snap. Gavin, she said, blocking my path. We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you, I replied coldly, stepping around her. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Please, just hear me out. I stared at her hand until she let go, then crossed my arms. You've got 2 minutes. Melissa took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. I know you're doing this to Victor. I don't know how, but I can feel it. Gavin, this is dangerous. You don't understand the kind of people he's tied to. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. Oh, you mean the offshore accounts and the shady loans? Yeah, I think I have a pretty good idea. Her eyes widened. So it is you. I didn't deny it, and her panic deepened. Gavin, you don't know what you're messing with. Victor's. He's got connections. Powerful people who won't just sit back and let this happen. A cold smile crept onto my face. Good. Maybe they'll teach him a thing or two about betrayal. Her voice cracked as she pleaded. You've made your point. You've taken everything from him. Just stop now before this spirals out of control. I leaned in, lowering my voice to a deadly calm. You think this is about teaching him a lesson? Melissa, he walked into my life, took my trust, and burned it to the ground. You helped him do it. This isn't about making a point. It's about justice. Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt nothing. You're going to get hurt, Gavin. Please, let this go. I stepped back, shaking my head. You made your choices, Melissa. Now live with them. Without waiting for a reply, I walked away, leaving her standing there, broken and defeated. That night, I couldn't sleep. Melissa's warning gnawed at the edges of my resolve, but I refused to let it shake me. Victor might have been connected, but men like him were all the same. They thought they were untouchable until they weren't. Still, I couldn't ignore the possibility of blowback. I decided to take precautions, starting with a secure email server and scrubbing my digital trail. I'd already been careful, but paranoia had a way of sharpening instincts. The last thing I needed was for Victor to find a way to trace this back to me. 2 days later, the inevitable happened. Victor's car, a sleek, obnoxious sports model, was nowhere to be seen in the company parking lot. By lunchtime, word spread that he had officially resigned. The whispers were electric, a mix of schadenfreude and speculation about what had finally pushed him over the edge. Rachel, ever the office gossip, filled me in over coffee. Apparently, the board gave him an ultimatum: resign or face public humiliation when the investigation wraps up. Guess he chose the lesser evil, I said, hiding my satisfaction behind a sip of my drink. Looks like it. But you know what's crazy? His wife left him. Filed for divorce yesterday. That stopped me mid-sip. His wife? Rachel nodded, lowering her voice. Yeah. Word is, she found out about his extracurricular activities. Looks like Melissa wasn't the only one. The irony hit me like a freight train. Victor, the man who thought he could have it all, now had nothing. His job, his reputation, his family, it was all gone. The thought should have felt satisfying, but instead, it left me with an odd emptiness. That evening, I drove past the office one last time. Victor's corner office, once a beacon of his dominance, was dark. The parking spot that had always held his car was empty. He was gone, wiped from the life he'd tried to ruin. As I pulled onto the highway, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Revenge had been sweet, but it wasn't enough. It wouldn't fix what he and Melissa had broken. The scars they'd left on me wouldn't fade overnight. But I had my dignity back, my sense of control. And that, I realized, was worth everything. I wasn't done yet. Not entirely. There was one more thing left to do. Melissa had warned me about consequences, about the fallout of my actions. Now, it was time to see if she was right. The fallout from Victor's implosion rippled further than I could have anticipated. It wasn't just his career and family that crumbled. His connections, his allies, and even his reputation in the larger business community took a massive hit. I watched from the sidelines as the man who once ruled over everything around him became a cautionary tale. But Melissa wasn't wrong about one thing. Victor's connections weren't the kind to let a mess like this slide. A week after Victor's resignation, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Just my name typed on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words typed in plain font. Careful who you play games with. Some games don't end well. No signature. No logo. Nothing to indicate where it had come from. My first thought was that it was a bluff, a scare tactic to rattle me into backing off. But the timing, combined with the silence that followed Victor's downfall, left a sour feeling in my gut. I decided to reach out to Jake. If anyone could help me figure out the source of the letter, it was him. Looks like someone's trying to spook you, Jake said, leaning back in his chair as he examined the note. I thought the same, I admitted. But I can't shake the feeling there's more to it. Jake nodded, his expression serious. Victor ran in circles that aren't exactly friendly. If he owes people money, or if they think he does, they might be sniffing around to see who tipped the domino. Can they trace it back to me? I asked, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. Doubt it, Jake replied. You covered your tracks pretty well, and the files I gave you didn't have your fingerprints on them. But people like this don't always need proof. Sometimes, suspicion is enough. That thought stuck with me long after I left Jake's. Over the next few days, I kept a low profile. I avoided my usual routines, took alternate routes to work, and made sure to vary my schedule enough that no one could predict where I'd be at any given time. Paranoia, maybe, but something about the whole situation had me on edge. Melissa, meanwhile, had gone quiet. No texts, no calls, no surprise confrontations outside the gym. It was as if she'd vanished, which was almost as unsettling as her earlier desperation. I couldn't decide if she was licking her wounds or plotting her next move. But the silence didn't last. One night, around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but something told me to answer. Gavin Brooks, the voice on the other end drawled, its tone cold and detached. You've been busy. My chest tightened. Who is this? You know who we are, the voice replied, ignoring my question. And we know who you are. What you've done. My grip on the phone tightened. If you've got something to say, say it. A low chuckle crackled through the line. Here's the deal, Gavin. You've meddled in things that don't concern you. We're willing to let bygones be bygones, but only if you stay out of it from here on out. No more leaks, no more games. And if I don't? I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. The pause on the other end of the line felt heavier than it should have. Let's just say you wouldn't like the alternative. Consider this a friendly warning. The call ended before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in a mix of anger and unease. Whoever they were, they wanted me to feel small, to feel cornered. But I wasn't the kind of man who's scared easily. Still, I couldn't ignore the possibility that this was bigger than I'd anticipated. If Victor's downfall had stirred up a hornet's nest, I needed to be ready for whatever came next. I wasn't about to back down, but I wasn't about to be reckless, either. That night, I took stock of everything. My files, my digital footprint, and the precautions I'd already taken. If this was a game of chess, I needed to think several moves ahead. Because one thing was clear. Victor wasn't the only enemy I was up against anymore. But I wasn't afraid of them. If they wanted to come for me, they'd find out just how prepared I could be. The call wasn't just a threat, it was a warning wrapped in a challenge. Whoever was on the other end wanted me to back off, but they underestimated me. My time as a Marine had taught me plenty about standing my ground, even when the odds weren't in my favor. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival, about proving I wasn't someone to be trifled with. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few days, I noticed little things. A car that seemed to show up everywhere I went, a man at the coffee shop who lingered just a bit too long, even the faint sense of being followed when I walked to my truck at night. Paranoia or not, I started taking precautions. Jake helped me install a couple of cameras around my motel room and truck. Nothing flashy, just enough to give me a record of anything suspicious. I started carrying a small tactical knife again, a habit I hadn't kept since my military days. Call it overkill, but something told me I'd need every advantage I could get. Work, meanwhile, was a circus. Victor's resignation had left a power vacuum, and everyone was scrambling to position themselves for his spot. The higher-ups hadn't named an interim replacement yet, and the uncertainty hung over the office like a storm cloud. I kept my head down, knowing better than to draw attention to myself. The chaos around me was almost comforting. It gave me space to stay invisible while I worked out my next steps. But that didn't mean I wasn't paying attention. Rachel pulled me aside during a coffee break, her eyes darting around as if she were afraid someone might overhear us. "Gavin, have you heard anything about Victor lately?" I shook my head, keeping my expression neutral. "Not since the news broke." "Why?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "Something feels off. Like, people are still whispering about him, but it's not just about the scandal anymore. There's this weird vibe, like he's still pulling strings somehow." The words sent a chill down my spine. Victor might have been disgraced, but he wasn't the type to go quietly. If he was still in the game, that meant I wasn't as far ahead as I'd thought. "Probably just rumors," I said, trying to reassure her. "Once someone like Victor falls, people love to keep talking about him." Rachel didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. "Maybe. Just keep your eyes open, okay?" "Always do," I replied, forcing a small smile. That night, I got another call, this time from Melissa. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "What do you want?" I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. She hesitated, then said, "Victor's not done with you, Gavin. He's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." The warning felt genuine, but I wasn't in the mood for sympathy. "You think I don't know that? You picked your side, Melissa. Why are you calling me now?" "Because I'm scared," she snapped, her voice breaking. "Victor's unraveling, Gavin. He's blaming me for everything, saying I led you to him. I don't know what he's planning, but you need to be careful." Her fear was palpable, but it wasn't enough to erase my anger. "You helped him destroy everything I cared about. Now you want me to save you from the mess you made." "I didn't ask for that," she shouted. "I'm just trying to warn you, Gavin. Do whatever you want with it, but don't say I didn't try." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me with more questions than answers. If Melissa was right, then Victor wasn't just fighting to save himself, he was looking for someone to blame. And if I wasn't careful, that someone could be me. The next day, I woke up to find a note slipped under my motel door. No envelope this time, just a single sheet of paper with a chilling message. "Stay in your lane, Gavin. This is your last warning." The writing was bold, the letters jagged as if written in a rush. Whoever sent it wanted me to feel cornered, helpless. But all it did was fuel my resolve. I wasn't backing down. Not now. If Victor wanted to escalate this, he'd find out exactly how far I was willing to go. The storm was building, and I was ready for it. The note wasn't just a warning, it was a line drawn in the sand. Victor, or whoever he'd stirred up, wanted to make sure I knew they weren't playing games. But the thing about warnings is that they only work if you're afraid to push back. I wasn't. Still, I knew better than to walk into this blind. Whoever sent the note had found me at the motel, which meant they were watching. I called Jake again, laying everything out for him. The phone call, the shadowy figures, and now the note. His reaction was exactly what I expected. "Gavin, you need to move." "Like yesterday," he said. "These guys aren't bluffing. If they wanted to scare you, they've already done that. Next step is action." I knew he was right, but the thought of running didn't sit well with me. "I'm not leaving, Jake. Not yet." "Then you'd better be ready to fight," he said, his tone grim. "I'll send you a burner phone and some extra gear. Whatever you do, don't stick to a routine. If they know where you sleep, you're vulnerable." That last part hit home. I packed my bags and checked out of the motel that same night, paying cash for a different room across town. It wasn't much better, peeling wallpaper and a broken heater, but at least it gave me some breathing room. The next day, I went back to work as if nothing was wrong. It felt strange, sitting in my cubicle while knowing there was a target on my back. But blending in was part of the plan. The less attention I drew, the harder it would be for them to predict my next move. By mid-afternoon, the office was buzzing with another round of rumors. Rachel popped by my desk, her eyes wide with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," she whispered. "Victor's been spotted meeting with some pretty shady types downtown. Word is, he's trying to cut a deal." "What kind of deal?" I asked, feigning casual curiosity. She shrugged. "No one knows for sure, but it can't be good. Probably trying to save his skin." The pieces were starting to come together. If Victor was desperate enough to meet with his shady contacts in public, it meant he was losing control. That made him dangerous, but it also made him sloppy. I just needed to find the right way to use that against him. That evening, Jake called me back with an update. "Did some digging on Victor's connections," he said. "You're not dealing with small-time crooks here, Gavin. These guys have ties to international money laundering and fraud. If they think you're a threat, they won't hesitate to take you out." "Good to know," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "But if they're that powerful, why hasn't Victor leaned on them to shut this down already?" "Because they don't like messes," Jake explained. "And Victor's a mess right now. My guess? They're watching him as closely as they're watching you. If he can't clean up his act, he's just as expendable." That gave me an idea. Victor might have been the one pulling strings before, but now he was just another pawn. If I could make his so-called allies lose faith in him, it could cut him off at the knees. "Jake, can you track where Victor's been meeting these guys?" I asked. "Already on it," he said. "I'll send you the locations. Just be careful, Gavin. This isn't the kind of fight you can walk away from unscathed." "I know," I replied, the weight of his words settling in. "Thanks, Jake." That night, I parked near one of the locations Jake had flagged, a high-end restaurant on the outskirts of town. I stayed in the shadows, watching as sleek cars came and went. Around 9 p.m., a black SUV pulled up, and Victor stepped out, flanked by two men who looked like they'd be more at home breaking kneecaps than ordering wine. I followed at a safe distance as they entered the restaurant, taking a seat near the back. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. Victor was pleading, gesturing wildly with his hands while the other two sat stone-faced, barely acknowledging him. They weren't buying whatever he was selling. After about an hour, the meeting ended abruptly. Victor left alone, his shoulders hunched like a man carrying the weight of the world. The two men stayed behind, their expressions unreadable as they finished their drinks. I snapped a few photos from my phone and slipped away before anyone noticed me. If I couldn't bring down Victor directly, maybe I could convince his friends that he wasn't worth the trouble. The storm was closing in, and I was ready to push it over the edge. The endgame came quicker than I anticipated. Victor was unraveling faster than a frayed rope, and I was there to tug at every loose thread. The photos I took at the restaurant, combined with Jake's intel, painted a damning picture of a man on the verge of collapse. All I had to do was deliver the final blow. I spent the next morning crafting an anonymous package, addressed directly to Victor's associates. Jake had provided just enough information on their operations for me to know where to send it. Inside, I included the photos from their meeting, a printout of some of Victor's more incriminating emails, and a simple note. Victor Sterling has become a liability. His failures are dragging you down. Do what you need to do before it's too late. It wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. People like them didn't require much convincing when it came to cutting ties with someone who threatened their bottom line. All I had to do was nudge them in the right direction. By the time I dropped the package in the mailbox, I felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, about ensuring Victor's actions didn't go unpunished. A few days later, I got my answer. The news broke in the late afternoon. Victor Sterling had been arrested at his home, escorted out in handcuffs while a swarm of reporters shouted questions. The charges ranged from fraud to money laundering, with whispers of more serious offenses lurking beneath the surface. I watched the footage from the motel room, a quiet satisfaction settling over me. The man who had thought himself untouchable was now at the mercy of a justice system he'd spent years dodging. His smug grin was gone, replaced by a look of hollow defeat. Melissa called that evening. I didn't answer. She tried again an hour later, leaving a voicemail this time. Her voice was frantic, filled with panic and fear. "Gavin, it's over. Victor's done. But I'm scared. These people he was working with, they're ruthless. Please, I need to talk to you. I don't know who else to turn to." I deleted the message without hesitation. Whatever mess she'd gotten herself into was her problem now. I had given her my trust once, and she'd destroyed it. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the motel for good. Jake's advice had been invaluable, and I owed him more than I could ever repay. Before I hit the road, I gave him a call. "It's done," I said simply. "Glad to hear it," Jake replied. "You staying in town?" "No," I said, staring at the horizon. "Time to move on." Jake didn't press for details. He just chuckled softly. "Well, don't be a stranger, Gavin. You know where to find me." I thanked him and hung up, feeling lighter than I had in months. As I drove out of town, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Melissa's betrayal, Victor's downfall, the constant shadow of danger. I'd survived it all, but not without scars. Trust was a fragile thing, and mine had been shattered beyond repair. But for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the weight of anger and betrayal. Free to start over. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to carve out. I didn't look back as the town disappeared in my rearview mirror. Let them deal with the wreckage. I had a new life to build, far away from the ashes of the one they'd destroyed.